Welcome to the Real Talk Podcast, where we create conversation and community among real people about everyday issues. This is a place for you to hear truth, connect with others, and find answers to your questions.
Hey everybody, welcome to Real Talk, where we discuss real issues with real people. My name is Alan Reed, and I'm the host of the show, and we are excited to be in this series on grief. Let's be honest, over this past year, it's just been full of struggle, lots of people that are hurting and with loss, and so we decided that we would do this series so that way, hopefully, we can encourage some of you that maybe are struggling during this season. And our strategy is simple. We're just talking with people that we have heard their story and we've known that they've gone through loss or struggle of some kind, but we've also seen a hint of growth through that season of time as well. And so before we get started, I just want to remind those of you, if you are watching us on YouTube, make sure and hit that subscribe button. You can also follow us on Instagram or any major podcasting platform. Also, at the end of the show, I'm going to give a little bit more information on this, but we do have a group that's getting started in mid-September, September 15th, and it's called Grief Share. So if you have experienced loss, you would like to be a part of a group or a class where you are going through some of the discussions, important topics that deal with grief, and to be able to do it with other people that are dealing with a loss. You can either fast forward to the end and hear that information, or at the end, just know that we're going to be promoting that as well, and we would love for you to be a part of that. Today, we have on as a special guest, Stephanie McKissick. And Stephanie, we're grateful that you are coming and being a part of this show and sharing your story today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And we talked last week a little bit, and if I remember correctly, tomorrow is an important day for you. Is that right?
Yes, big step. Going back to school after 23 years, going to get my master's degree in counseling, specializing in family and marriage counseling at JBU, John Brown University. So tomorrow's my first class.
That's awesome. Very exciting. Best of luck to you.
Thank you.
That. You also have two beautiful girls. I believe at least one of them's in college.
Yes.
Right? Your oldest?
Abigail, she is a junior year-wise, but she's actually a senior hour-wise in college at Arkansas Tech.
Okay.
And then I have a junior in high school, Lauren.
Right, yeah.
And she's at Rogers High School.
Okay. Very good. Well, a big part of your story that we're going to unpack a little bit today is the fact that over the past, I believe, 4 or 5 years, you've had to kind of relearn how to raise these girls, but as a single mom.
Right.
And so we're going to unpack that story a little bit today. And as we do that, how about we do this? Why don't you just back up a couple years before that? Tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, maybe a little bit about your childhood, your aspirations as you lead into this topic and your own story that's dealt with grief and dealt with God refining you during that season of time and everything. So.
Okay. Well, I was born and raised in a Christian home. My parents had been raised in Christian homes, and that was something that was important to them to do. And so not only did we go to church every time the doors were open, but my parents were also very faithful in teaching me about God and His Word and a relationship with Jesus and how important that is. And so I was saved at the age of 9 at church camp. And then when I was 12, I prayed a prayer at a youth rally, actually. We used to have those. I don't think they really do that much anymore, but and I just remember saying to God, I want you to use my life for your service, whatever that might look like. I'm giving myself to you, And so I went on through high school, junior high school, college, living my life for the Lord, bobbling here and there, but my desire was to live for Him and to do what He wanted and what His Word said. And so I had sort of a squeaky clean high school and college career time there, and I'm very thankful for that. A lot of people cannot say that, and so I'm very thankful for that. And in the time of my teen years, I started praying for a spouse, whoever that might be, at some point in my life, that God would provide the right person for me.
Mm-hmm.
And my parents had done that along my growing up as well. And, just so many of those things were very important to pray about, as I became an adult. And so that's kind of my story leading up to adulthood.
Yeah, and that's pretty common. I know that my wife has a similar story of just praying for her future husband.
Yes,
and
that
things
was
like that.
It was very, through youth group and through church and through my parents,
Mm-hmm.
and it was encouraged, and very important, I think, to be doing that, for your kids and for yourself, as you're growing up, and so that you have that guidance, from God, and so.
Right. Okay. So pick up, I guess, in that season when you met your husband.
Okay. So I was in my third year of college when I met a man, and we hadn't, we met. We had never known each other like growing up or anything. He had moved new to my area and was going to my church. And he was a couple years older than me, so he was done with school. And he had recently become a Christian and surrendered his life to Christian ministry kind of at the same time. He felt that's what God was calling him to do. And I had known other Christian boys growing up, but had never met anyone quite like him. And the fact that he was sold out to Jesus, as we used to say, just very on fire for the Lord, wanting to tell people. He did have somewhat of a radical transformation. His story and background was different in that he did not grow up in a Christian home. He had kind of a rough teen years, had dabbled a little bit in alcohol, had gotten in some trouble, here and there, but, then was saved, and God turned his life around. And it was like God dropped him, right into my life, and we hit it off. We had a lot in common as far as our zeal for the Lord and wanting to minister, for the Lord in our lives. And within a few months' time, we started dating, and then we're engaged within a few months' time. And then within a year of meeting each other, we had gotten married, which is really fast. But it works. A lot of people, it really works, and so I wasn't worried. He was a youth pastor at the time, and that was his first area of ministry. And so at a church in Southeast Arkansas, and we really enjoyed that time together with a youth group, a decent sized little youth group.
So when you guys got married, you were wrapping
right
up college,
into it,
right?
Yes, I had one.
He was serving.
Yes, I had 1 year of college left when we got married, and he was serving in that church, and but it was a lot of fun, going alongside and helping him do youth events and Bible studies, and so. So about 2 years into that youth pastorate, the pastor of that church was called to another ministry, and our church voted my husband to be the pastor of the church. He had gotten quite a bit of speaking experience just on Sunday nights, or, whenever the opportunity arose, our pastor would let him speak. And even though he was a very new in the ministry, he just soaked up the Bible. He studied the Bible all the time and just soaked it in. And he was a very good speaker, very good communicator. People just understood when he spoke. And maybe it was because he was coming from that place of not having grown up in it, maybe, So we were at that church for about 3 more years. And then we're asked to go to Fredericksburg, Virginia, to plant a church. So we had not been married very long, and we had Abigail, who was just 1, when we moved way, way, way far away.
And so your family's from here,
yes,
right?
my parents were about 30 minutes away from us at the time, in Southeast Arkansas, and then his parents were living up in this area.
Right.
So to go way out to Fredericksburg was a big deal. Of course, there was prayer and thought put into it, and I had always prayed, God, whatever you want me to do. And then when I married this man who was the spiritual leader of my family, and I would pray for God to guide him, and then in turn would ask God to help me follow without complaint. And that's what I did. It was sad. It was hard. But we did it, and we didn't know anyone in Fredericksburg. It was just me and him and the baby. But within about 2 years' time, we had a fully supportive church congregation of about 200 people.
Which is incredible.
It is incredible.
For 2
God
years,
really worked and blessed. We met some people, very dear friends of mine to this day, when we got out there shortly after, through some connections, who had been in Bible college and had moved out there for his job, and they were looking for a church to help.
Yeah.
And God just lined it all up. He's very musically inclined. She was great with children. So they really helped us in making connections and going out and meeting people. And I don't know, the area was starved for a church founded on biblical principles. There weren't a lot of good, solid Bible preaching churches in the area. And I think people were hungry, and they just came. So our church was a lot of new Christians. A lot of them got saved once they started coming, and that sort of thing. So we were there, I was out there in Fredericksburg a total of about 11 and a half years.
Okay.
We had our second daughter while we were out there, and things seemed to be going very well in our church. And although I did not ever realize that something was wrong at home, because you're sort of living in it and you don't realize how bad it is. But there was also a lot of controlling nature coming from my husband toward me. He began to sort of encourage me to cut some people out of my life that had been very dear friends for most of my life and most of my teen years and college years, very good Christian friends and people that had been a big part of my life, but and family members that he said they weren't, a good influence on me, or they weren't good for me to be around. And it was subtle. It wasn't harsh or mean. It was just subtle here and there. And I, being the submissive wife and thinking that God was using him and speaking through him to other people, I assumed he knew what he was talking about. And I did it. I cut a lot of people out, and we were way out there away from everyone. And it was sort of easy, for him to have me do that. And so, although I had friends in my church, and I had people around me that loved me and that I could call friends. It was just a little strange looking back that all happened. Yeah.
And that happened a couple of years into that ministry.
Being out there, yes, okay. A couple of years into being out in Virginia. Okay. That's when all that started. Then I'd say about 3 years after we had gotten that church to a self-supportive status, 2 years or so maybe, my husband at the time started becoming friends with some people that were in a different denomination, maybe is the right word, or different theology than we were in, and had always preached and believed. And at the same time, some things started happening that, now looking back, I see them lining up. At the time, I did not, but there were things that started happening in our home that were just confusing, and I didn't know what was going on. And we had never fought. We had never had issues like that, but we started having some of those issues. he would leave for a time, to go and do something that should only take an hour and might be gone 3, or, different things started happening with his behavior. And it just was confusing, it wasn't right. It wasn't normal, but I couldn't put my finger on it, and of course I questioned myself, maybe I'm just having a bad attitude, or maybe I'm missing, imagining things,
Right.
That type of deal. But at first that was sort of sporadic, but it happened more and more. And then he began having some health problems, and we went to a doctor, and the doctor said, you need to go to a neurologist because this is seeming to be more serious. So we did. We went to a neurologist, and he told the doctor all of his symptoms, and the doctor diagnosed him with an autoimmune disease, which was scary because I didn't want my husband to be sick or have health issues. And so we had people praying everywhere that he would be healed from that and that he wouldn't struggle with that, because a lot of it involved some muscle function issues and vision. One of his eyes would not stay open all the time, and he was tired a lot, passing out way early in the evening in his chair and not wanting to get up and that sort of thing. So that led to more erratic behavior from him as time went on. And I
kind of thought it was connected maybe to his not feeling well.
Yes, I did. I once again grew up very, very conservative family, very sheltered, not in a strange way, but just from anything that, and I would have never thought anything else was going on with my preacher husband who, preached against so many things that people were doing that were sin and were causing issues in their homes. And so, but yes, things got worse, and he became very angry with me a lot. There were situations where he could not speak, and I was very concerned, and I was worried, and all of these things. And so I began praying, because all along this time, since we had gotten married, I had also become very afraid of him. Not that he would hurt me physically, but of his words, because of the way he controlled and manipulated. And I was afraid to ever come against him or to accuse him of anything or to even bring up something that might upset him, because I didn't want to be put in my place when I did so. So I tried not to rock the boat with him. But I began praying for God to show me if it was me that was causing issues, because he seemed so angry at me, and he seemed to be gone a lot, and or to give me just the courage to figure it out, or to confront him about it or whatever. And one evening, he had gotten up to go take a shower from the living room. Our girls were in the bed, and I feel like it was the Holy Spirit sent me over to his water bottle that was by the chair that he was sitting in, and I opened it and smelled it, and it did not. It had a smell that shouldn't have, if it was water. Yeah. And
it was alcohol.
It was alcohol. Yeah. And I told you it was kind of a funny part of this is that I had no idea.
You're a good Baptist. You
didn't
Baptist.
Know
your alcohol.
I didn't know my alcohol. And I immediately Googled clear alcohol liquid. I just didn't know. And of course, found out what that was. And but I didn't say anything that night. I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. And all the things went through my head of, I should call my parents. No, I shouldn't, because if we can work through this, they don't need to know. And I don't have anyone out here I can tell, because they're all his parishioners.
Right. And all your former friends, you kind of had
cut off.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And I really felt alone at that point. And took probably another month with things continuing to escalate. I became scared at nighttime because he would get so angry with me. Yeah. And I was afraid. Once again, he never laid a hand on me physically, but I was afraid he was going to.
Yeah.
And
were things adding up? I mean, you talked about the fact that because of his autoimmune, disorder or whatever, his illness, that he was
Yes.
falling asleep and being tired at the end of the day. So some of it may have been being sick, but some of it may have been that all along he had been drinking and, knowing
well,
about
yes, it was adding up. And
Yeah.
I thought, I realized at that point, he didn't tell those doctors he was drinking alcohol. He just
Right.
described the symptoms.
Yeah.
And it was almost like he did it to have a cover up, and so, I'm praying through it. God's showing me all these things. I'm fearful. And, I just, one night things were so bad that we had gone to a movie with our girls, and I knew he had the vodka in the water bottle that he took into the movie.
Mhm.
And we came out to the car, and he should not have been driving. And I tried to get the keys from him. Now, him not knowing that I knew yet, that I'd figured it out, but he wouldn't give them to me, and created a big scene. And thank God we lived like maybe 3 miles from the movie theater. And I prayed all the way home that we would arrive safely. And we did. And that's going to sound strange maybe to some, that I would get in the vehicle with my husband who was intoxicated, but that's how much fear I had of knowing how to handle it or confront him or what to do, and how kind of controlled I was.
Yeah.
But that night we got home, and I put the kids to bed, and I got the courage from the Lord to confront him and ask him, had he been drinking? And he broke down and sobbed and admitted it, and told me how long it had been going on, which added up to the time frame of the changes that I had seen in him, and going back to that new theology that we had,
Right.
that we,
And that group of friends.
Mhm.
So,
and honestly, to this day, I don't believe that group of friends, I don't believe any of them drink.
okay.
But they believe this particular theology that says, if you're the elect, God will, you're going to make it to heaven no matter what, basically.
Yeah.
And
Obviously kind of misusing any kind of theology.
yes,
That,
and
yeah.
I don't think that everyone that believes that theology
Right.
misuses it at all, but I believe he did.
Yeah.
And I believe
Yeah.
I have asked him if that's the reason, and he denies it, but I believe that's why he went in that direction.
Yeah.
Honestly.
It's funny how we can take
Yes.
our own beliefs and justify some of the things that we do.
Absolutely.
And so he was doing that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that night he said to me that he wanted help. And I said, good, let's call. And I named off men from our church who were deacons, who were leaders. And I said, they will help you. They love you. They will do whatever we need to get you some help. And he said, oh no, we can't tell them.
Mhm.
And I, in my naivety, did not realize that was a bad sign.
Yeah.
It was a sign that he wasn't ready to get help.
Yeah.
And he said, you can be my accountability partner, which I thought, perfect. I'm your helpmate. That's what I'm supposed to do. But it was the worst thing I could have ever done, because at that point, he knew that I knew, and I knew the signs now. And if he had been drinking, even though he had surrendered his debit card to me, I was supposed to know when he had cash, all these things. If I confronted him when he came through the door, he would threaten to leave me. He would get furious and tell me he wasn't living under a microscope. And it was just on and on for several months, this struggle, and me begging him to tell and to get help. And still I wasn't reaching out to anyone, because I kept hoping it would get fixed, and praying, and in the midst of praying, and there were many more months of praying for him to get help. I was praying for God to do it. And what I wasn't realizing was that, God can do it, but it was that my husband wasn't ready and wasn't wanting to do it.
Yeah.
And, God doesn't make robots, and that's my own personal opinion there, and I believe. Right. And so he was waiting on him to make a move.
Yes. Yeah.
But God did work in the situation. A few months after me confronting him, he came to me and said, "I think we need to move back to Arkansas near your parents," which was incredible because I needed my parents. I needed help.
Yeah, maybe some hope that
yes,
solution.
Yes, he thought it could be a fresh start. He said, "Maybe I will we can start over and I will get help." That was always his promise.
So did he find a ministry job when he came down here, or was it?
Well, he was supposed to get a job.
Yeah.
Not in a church, but just go find a job and support our family, which he did not do.
Okay.
My dad was pastoring a small church at the time in Siloam Springs, and actually gave him a small job, a small role there. Once again, I had not told my parents yet.
Yeah.
They just knew we were having troubles, and we're praising Jesus that that we got back to him, And so he put him on the payroll there at the church, and he was helping in some Bible studies and things like that, which I was in turmoil over because I didn't feel he should be doing it.
Yeah.
Because the drinking didn't stop once we got here. It actually intensified. And I, of course, had begged him to talk to my dad, or let's go to my dad together, or let's, find a program here for you. And it got worse and it got worse. And if I wanted to go see my parents, who just lived 5 minutes away after a few months we had lived with them, but then we got our own place. If I wanted to go see my parents, even 5 minutes away, he would get angry with me.
He was afraid, I'm sure.
Yeah,
afraid.
he thought I was going to tell, and there were many times I wanted to, but I didn't have the courage and was just waiting and praying for a change. I just kept expecting. He kept promising, and he would go a couple of weeks sometimes, and then it would be all over again. But one particular night, and this was in 2015, after there were many nights sort of leading up to it getting worse and worse, and he would be passed out on the couch at like 2:00 in the afternoon. Once again, not working.
Yeah. And your kids were how old at this time?
They were in 4th and 8th grade.
Okay. Yeah.
So
they're old enough to kind of realize something's not right.
Yes. Yep. And of course, their daddy told them about his autoimmune disease. We weren't communicating anything yet, but I wanted to tell the world, obviously, help me, someone. And I wanted my kids to know what was going on, but, you're just trying to wait and see. But one night, he had, there were several nights leading up, like I said, to just weird events and things, him just being messed up, and he's saying kind of strange things, and the kids being like, "What's wrong with Daddy?" and asking me more questions. And but one particular night, he picked up a whole handful of pencils and told my youngest that he was going to throw them at her if she didn't do something. And it was like some silly like dance, or I don't know. It was something just weird that he was wanting her to do. And
but it made her uncomfortable.
It made her uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And he said, "I'll throw these pencils at you if you don't do them." And that's when I just said, "All right, girls, we're going to bed." And that was the night that she said to me, and I didn't know this, but the night before, during family prayer time, which he continually insisted we do, even if he was intoxicated, I was leading the prayer the night before, and he was poking and prodding and playing with her on the couch. And that bothered her more than him threatening to throw pencils, because here's her daddy, who was always encouraging prayer and how important it is, was trying to play with her. Now, she was in the 4th grade at the time. And that scared her. And that night when I put them to bed, she said, "I don't understand what's going on. Daddy wants to play with me during prayer time instead of pray." And that was a big deal. And she was crying. And I knew I had to do something. Because of the threat to, it was pencils, but still he was threatening to harm my kid or our kid, and so I determined to call my dad the next morning and tell him everything. And so I did. And immediately, he wanted to help and he wanted to get my husband some help.
Yeah.
And he had gone off mad because he knew I was calling my dad. And I called his dad as well, who lived in Texas, and told him everything.
Yeah.
And he called his son and said, "Get home, now." And he came home. We had a huge, once again, confession time. He sobbed.
Come to Jesus moment.
Yes,
Yeah.
with my dad there. He said, "I'll do whatever we need to do. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll get marriage counseling. I'll go to AA. I'll meet with men for accountability." And so he went before the men of our church there that we were going to and confessed, and they set up a plan to help him be accountable. And it was one of them was going to call him each day, and they were going to meet with them, but he didn't answer their phone calls. And that night, after that whole confession with the men, and I'll do whatever it takes, and I'll go to marriage counseling, he came home and he did not speak to me for 3 days. Which I knew was another bad sign.
Yeah, you're saying one thing. Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
And so I told him that night that I was giving him 30 days to show me some change. And I said, if you don't show me that you're really willing, we're going to have to do something different, because this is destructive. Yeah. Our kids are seeing it. It's not good. It's not a good situation for anybody. And
this had been going on for how many years?
Well, at this point, it was about 5 years that it had been going on, and just more and more spiraling downward and more destruction. And I would think sometimes, like, we wouldn't let, you come in our home and behave the way he had been behaving in front of our children at times. And more and more times he had driven, maybe when he left the house, I did not know, like with one of our kids, that he was drinking. But when they would come back from somewhere, I could tell he had slipped a water bottle of vodka in his, in his car. And it was just more and more, the everything was just getting out of control. And so he wasn't working. He still wasn't getting a job. He was substituting some at some of the schools there. They took him off the payroll at the church, obviously, when he came out and confessed. But we lived in a home that my dad owned. We were renting from him. And so about 28 days into the big Come to Jesus meeting, he was passed out on the couch one night early, and I couldn't get him up. And so I called my dad, and I told him that I wanted him to come over the next morning at 8:00. It was a Saturday morning. And I said, "I want you to come because I'm making him leave." Because I told him that night, one more drink and you have to leave. You can't stay here. Yeah. And so I knew I had to do it for the sake of everyone. I'm hoping for him to wake up call, just a reality check that I meant business. And so I prayed the whole night, and I had notified his dad. And my dad showed up the next morning, and the kids were there. My mom said, "Do you want me to bring the kid? Come get the kids?" I said, "No, I want them to know the truth. I want them to see what's really been going on." And so I, prayed for God to give me strength, and it had to be his strength, because I could have never done it as calm as I did, without crying, without fear, as I had, as I was able to do it. And, once he woke up, my dad, he comes in the living room, and my dad was sitting in there, and he said, "What's going on?" And I just told him, you've done it the last time. We're not doing this anymore, and you have to go. And he said, "Where should I go?" And I said, "Well, your dad's offered to let you come stay with him for a couple months till you get your life figured out, to figure out, get some help. But there will be no alcohol, and your dad will be checking." I mean, the man's 42 years old at the time, maybe.
Right.
And his dad was offering to check his breath every day,
So you had already spent years, I mean, at least 5 or 6 at this time, excuse me, and knowing that something needed to happen, patiently waiting, praying,
Yes,
and
begging.
according, to your
God.
perspective, just trying to submit. And so everything that you thought you could do, but you mustered up probably some courage,
Yeah.
probably some encouragement from your parents that
Yes.
this has got to stop.
Absolutely.
And hopefully to where this could just shake them awake, as in like, I've got to get my life together.
Yes,
My
I'm
life
going to
is
lose my family.
right. Okay, so what happens?
So I suggested he go to his dad's or to check himself into some type of rehab facility, an in-house. I said, you can't come home to get help. And at that point, I wasn't even thinking of not ever being married to him again.
Yeah.
I wanted him to get help, and so he left after some verbal struggle, threatening to take my kids away from me. And I say my kids a lot because they have become my kids, I feel like, through all of this mostly. But and they heard that threat, which made them scared. But he did not go to a rehab facility or his dad's. He started heading out to Virginia and calling friends out there and confessing that what he had been doing, and at the same time drinking.
Yeah.
And he got to somewhere in Middle Tennessee, and he wrecked his vehicle. He hit a guardrail and flipped, landed into a tree, kind of crashed into a tree. Thankfully, no one else was involved, and thankfully he wasn't badly injured. But he did go to jail that night, and they let him out the next day without a vehicle because it was totaled.
Yeah. This was how many years ago?
This was April of 2015.
Okay.
Yeah.
So 6 years have gone by,
Mm-hmm.
and you have the story that you're sharing has gone on and on and on. Promises.
Yes. Yes.
Supposedly seeking help, coming out, no change at all. And so in the past 6 years, you've separated.
Right.
You divorced him. And even, I think you shared recently in the past year, a similar type of episode.
Yes.
And so, you know.
It's just been the ongoing saga of dealing with it over and over again. You think, oh, here's a sign that he's going to do better. And then, the kids, my oldest hasn't had much to do with him at all. The youngest has tried, but in recent months has separated from him because it's just a continual disappointment and a continual hurting.
So this is not just a story of grief on your part, but a grieving for your girls.
Yes.
And I think back to the beginning of our story when I said, hey, start back, when you were younger. You had dreams praying for a husband, a calling into ministry, or at least God, whatever you say, the answer is yes.
Yes.
And things seem to line up. And so the loss in this case is a loss of a dream,
right?
The loss of a marriage, and
loss of a ministry. Yeah,
a ministry.
At the time, I remember asking a pastor who actually he was going to some counseling for. Before our divorce was final, he was going to this pastor here in the area, and that man called me to ask me questions. And one of the things he said to me was, which was helpful because I thought, now what do I do? There goes my ministry, and I had identified as a child of God, but also as a pastor's wife for 18 years. And he said, Stephanie, your ministry is just getting started. You're going to have so many opportunities now, to minister. And he's been right. He was right about that.
Yeah, but even in the midst of your own struggle, he was even able to speak a future for you and some hope. And
yes, absolutely. And that's, the grieving part came, once with the loss of the marriage, with the loss of, my children losing a whole family unit and the loss of the ministry. But, and there was grief. I didn't know what it was because I'd never really experienced it, but it was those waves that would hit you out of nowhere. And I'd heard people describe that with a death in their family or in their home, that it would hit in waves or come out of nowhere. They would go along fine, and then it would just tear them up. And that's kind of how it worked. And my counselor actually told me, it's a grief. You're grieving. And I never really knew that could happen from a divorce. But yes, there have been so many different times where God has provided. Well, He's provided for me and the girls over and over through various means. My parents have been rock stars for sure. God has blessed them financially, and they've been able to help, come alongside and help whenever we needed that. And just my dad stepping in kind of a role because the kids have not had a dad because he's never gotten his life together. And even through other stints of rehab, it just keeps happening. But God has been faithful, and even in the sense that I was asked to do this tonight, someone heard me say something 4 years ago at a ladies' retreat that struck a chord and thought maybe her story might fit in here.
Yeah.
And when I sometimes get angry, and I do, I've had my little anger spurts, not at God in the sense of, being mad at God, but just, I don't understand God. Like, I lived my life for you and wanted to do that squeaky clean image as best I could, following your word, shining your light. What in the world happened here,
Yeah.
And I've questioned my own sense of knowing God's will or seeing, did I miss that? Was I wrong there? And, but I have those little spurts, and then He comes back and reminds me through ways like this even, here's confirmation that I still want to use you, and that you can still, be in a ministry for me in some way.
It sounds like in the midst of your grieving, I know last week we interviewed Kimberly and James Crumby. I think them through choir, right?
Yes.
And James and Kimberly described that their reaction in that grief was different. He was angry with God, and I think if I remember correctly, it took months or maybe even a little bit longer, a year or two, to where he could even open up and allow God to even speak into things through others or whatever else. Right. But in Kimberly, I think it was just more of where she just got inward, and she just said, I was just grumpy. I was just grumpy at that time. But it sounds like you quickly got counsel, went to counseling. I'm sure you had your parents pouring into you. Did you have a season where you were angry at God, or was it more of just questioning yourself? What did I do wrong? And maybe blaming yourself, or how did that process go immediately within that time?
Well, I think immediately after, it was almost maybe like in shock. And I knew I have to keep going for my kids. I have to, I know where we need to be is with God's people. And so whereas I have friends that have been through horrible situations in their marriages, and they wouldn't go to church. They were, they didn't want to be there because they were mad. And I think for me, whether or not it was just, like I said, kind of overdrive kicking in. I don't know. I just knew that's where I needed to be, and I need to get my kids there. Yeah. And sometimes sitting in church, I would feel a little angry or confused, or, those thoughts come into your head like, this is the place that hurt, this is the place that hurt me. And yes. Okay. And then, but here I am, and because I knew it's where I needed to be. But honestly, I didn't really feel a lot of anger till my kids started getting a little older.
Yeah.
And it was whenever they started getting into like having their own issues or struggles, and I would have thoughts like, now, I would even say to God, I'm doing this alone, God, like, what are you doing? I don't have another parent here to help me make these decisions, to help me counsel my kid. I have to do it on my own. Or what in the world, those type of things. I didn't ever feel like I was like shaking my fist at God, like I've heard people say, but I have had my angry moments. And a lot of times it's when other troubled moments come in to play, and I'm having to do it alone. Yeah. And I don't have, even some people who are divorced have another parent who is minded in such a way that they can go to for help with their child or with their children. And I cannot.
Right.
do that.
Yeah.
And
And being a pastor's kid is hard enough,
yes,
right?
right.
And then to go through what you guys went through and everything. I
Yes.
know Ashley and I, when our kids were young, our fear was for our kids. They're growing up with Christian parents,
Yes.
and I'm a pastor, she's a pastor's wife, and
Yes.
our prayer was, Lord, just help our kids to experience the gospel.
Yes.
But yet you don't know what you're praying when you're saying that. You know what I mean? And I have a child that went through some struggles just being a pastor's kid, and she had a hard time in middle school and high school, and kind of going through a season herself.
Right.
And I'm just like, Lord, maybe this is where the gospel's inserted, into her life.
Right.
And so, we pray for her working through some of those issues, right? And so, that's going to be my prayer for your kids.
Thank you.
They may be
Yeah.
struggling and may be blaming God too. And so our prayer can be,
Yes.
Lord, help them to not just know about the gospel from a head knowledge, but to experience that
Right.
from you.
And that's been, it's been a hard thing to sort of separate from when you see your kids getting older and becoming adults.
Yeah.
You want to give them room to figure it out on their own and not just do it because mom said or whatever.
Yeah.
But the panic kind of kicks in at times. And
Yeah.
then I remember, God, you've got this.
Yeah.
I don't have it. No one else has it. You've got it. And
Yeah.
you've got her, and you're going to work in them. I've just got to sit back and let you do it your way and have faith and trust that everything's going to be okay. But yeah, it's, there have been those anger moments without a doubt. And, I think that every time I would have, one of those moments or a few of those days, and I like Kimberly's word grumpy. You said she used the word grumpy. I definitely have my grumpy days. And, but then something will happen. A friend that I haven't heard from in a long time will text me and check on me, or I will have an encouraging, word from someone, or a Pastor West's sermons will just really encourage me if I, and they all do, but there might be a particular one that really gets me, on a certain day, and because of where my attitude has been. And so even in the midst of the hardship and the grief and the hurting, there's always something that comes up to remind me he's not forgotten about me, you know?
Yeah.
So
I know that just in life experience, I know this for myself, having gone through a loss before, sometimes it takes a couple of years to be able to look back and to be able to see a little clearer, some life lessons, some things that God taught me through that. Not everything, not every hardship is a good thing, but there are good things that can come out of it, and even scripture, tells us that, So as you look back, and the thing with your story is there's you're still living it, and so you explained even last time that you go through a season, you go through maybe a step, but you're still having to deal with it, and so it'll come back, again. But what are some of the lessons you've learned? What has God taught you through this that maybe might encourage somebody else?
Well, one of the big things I learned, and I'm still not the best at it, although I haven't had to do this so much really with anyone else since, but I learned that I needed to stand up for myself and speak up for myself, because I didn't do that initially. I waited, and I was afraid to say anything to anyone for fear of, maybe this person will think less of me, or maybe, at the time he was threatening to leave me if I told, and just, all these things. And
maybe even some of your thoughts of, I'm not being submissive if I'm confronting him on this kind of thing.
Yes, because he would quote the verse in First Peter that says, wives, submit to your husbands at me.
Well,
and, you're like, oh my gosh, I need to do what he's saying, even though and that's how messed up I was in the midst of it all, because I was just under just such the destruction
Right.
and
Yeah.
oppression of it all. But
And in the midst of a healthy relationship, we see like in Ephesians 5 where a husband ought to love his wife like Christ loved the
yes,
church.
absolutely.
And while there may be somewhat of a submission or in that relationship, that's in a healthy context.
Yes, and
And so,
and it's easy to do when the husband is loving as he
right.
should.
And living sacrificially like
Yes.
Christ did, right?
Yes, absolutely. And but because of and that's just my nature anyway.
Yeah.
I'm a people pleaser,
Yeah.
but I learned through that experience to not keep my mouth shut.
That's good. Yeah.
to speak up for help when I needed to, and it's so important. I think if anyone else is going through anything like my story, or any kind of situation where you're in harm, or even a lot of times we think of harm or abuse as physical only, but there's a lot of abuse and harm that can be done mentally. Don't worry what other people are going to think about you. I was in a place of leadership, and I thought people are going to think badly of me or less of me if I speak up about this. And that's just not the case. Once I went back to those friends who I had cut off, and I went back to all of them and apologized. And of course, they all said, "We knew it wasn't you." And people will just show up from out of nowhere, encouraging and supporting you if you're in some kind of trouble and you speak up. So don't, I've learned, don't do that anymore.
Oh, that's
For
good.
sure.
And it's awesome to hear that some of those broken relationships from earlier, you've been able to rekindle those relationships and be able to.
Yes, one of them I just went to see in June, spent the week with her and her husband in South Carolina. So
that's awesome.
yes.
That's awesome. So obviously, with a series like this, talking about grief and talking about hope and a future, there's obviously going to be some people that are watching this and connecting with it, and probably people sharing this on. And so I think that piece of advice is really good, but there may be a scripture passage that's spoken to you, or a song, or maybe just like a final piece of advice that you might give to that person that's just like, look, I'm lost. I'm in the middle of it. What would you like to share with that person, whether it's a passage or a song or a piece of advice? What would you like to share with that person?
Well, there were so many, verses, songs that would mean something to me in the particular moment I was in. But if it's okay, I'll just read a couple of the verses because I don't want to get it wrong. But one of the passages that meant the most to me, and I even have it in my Bible, I have 2015, 2016, because that was the year of everything coming to a head and when everything kind of took place. But and most of my favorite verses from this time were in Psalm, somewhere in Psalm. Yeah. But this is Psalm 46, and I'll just read a couple of the verses in the beginning. It says, "God is our refuge and strength, a very ready help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth shakes and the mountains slip into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains quake at its swelling pride. There's a river whose streams make the city of God happy, the holy dwelling places of the Most High." And then on down, the one that everybody probably knows from that chapter more is verse 10, and the New American Standard says, "Stop striving and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted on the earth." And those first few verses I identified with because I felt like the mountains were slipping into the sea and the earth was shaking and it was roaring around me. Yeah. But reading on through that chapter, you get confirmation and you get encouragement to just be still, even if it feels like the world is blowing up around you. And I know what that feels like. I never did before. And I know that's another reason I can help people now that I could not help before. I could say the right things before, but now I know. And if your world feels like it is blowing up around you and earthquakes and mountains are falling apart, just be still and know that He is God. And I quoted those verses over and over and over to myself many nights and days through the process, and they really did help me. So,
your story is powerful in a way that you came out of a ministry struggling. And I think some people are going to be able to identify with you. There may be some of you that you've grown up in this church or a church, and you have all the right answers, and you've committed your life to Christ. Foundationally, when you gave your life to Him in so many ways, but maybe you find yourself in a similar situation where things have fallen apart. Life didn't go the way that you wanted to go, and it's just a good reminder that the gospel is for us.
Mm-hmm.
As believers, it's not just something that we share with someone who might be spiritually lost, but
Right.
the gospel's for us. The gospel's for us
Yes.
every day,
Absolutely.
and we forget that. So if that's you, just remember Christ died for you, and that message of the gospel isn't just for you to share; it's for you to receive, and for you to receive even as a believer, reminding yourself, Christ died for me in the midst of my sin, in the midst of my mess. One of my favorite passages is out of Isaiah 61. Our life group leaders know this verse because I share it every time we have a rally. And it's a passage that Jesus read at the very beginning of his ministry. And what I love about it is, Jesus quotes this verse. It's the first three verses of Isaiah 61. And he's basically saying that God has called me to preach the good news to the poor, and to unbind, those who were in prison, to free those who are held captive. And he's describing you and me. He's describing the church. It's a picture of mankind. And verse 3 is my favorite part. It says these people who are broken, who are imprisoned, who are held captive maybe by sin, they will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendor.
That's good.
And see, you could have just said, my story's over, or forget this, but you didn't. You held on to God, and He's given you a new start, a new chapter, and you're becoming an oak of righteousness, a planting of God for the display of His splendor. And
I hope so. That's my hope for sure.
And I'm confident He will. Whether it's through this podcast or some other means, you're going to continue to have ministry to be able to help people through struggles. And so
Thank you.
I do want to encourage those of you that are watching that are in the midst of grief. You may not identify with this story. It may be next week's story or last week's story. I want to remind you that God loves you. He loves you right where you're at. For Christ died while we were still in our sin. And so you don't have to change your behavior for God to love you. He loves you. And your job is just to respond to what He's done for you by sending His Son Jesus to die for your sins and my sins. Our lesson in our life group yesterday was about what Christ has done for us, a picture of Him as Lamb and as King. Right. And we can worship Him because He is our King, right? Absolutely. He's our mighty King. He's holy, but it wouldn't have been balanced if He didn't come as a lamb, as a sacrificial lamb, and He died for our sins. He did what we couldn't do for ourselves. And so we are going to be starting a grief share group on September 15th. It's going to be on a Wednesday evening at 6:30. We have childcare. You can go to our website, fbcrogers.org/midweek, and you'll see the grief share class among some other classes that are there. And we would love for you to sign up, be a part of that class. And James and Kimberly Crumby from last week will be a part of that study, among others as well. And you'll be able to begin a 10 to 12 week journey with them and with others that are going through struggles. Some of them they're going to be different. Some people, it's a loss of a loved one, someone that's passed away. It may be someone that's had a different loss, a divorce or something else. And so we just want to encourage you to prayerfully consider coming and being a part of that. And again, if you're viewing this on YouTube, subscribe, be a part of this, share this with someone that that might need this encouragement. And you can follow us on Instagram, on other podcasting platforms. We just want to be able to expand our ministry to be a blessing to other people. So help us to do that. And we're grateful for this time that we had together. And
thank you again for the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. God bless you guys, and we hope to see you next week.